back to the daily grind. Thanks for checking out the channel. Make sure to hit subscribe if you're new and hit thumbs up if you're not a baby back bagel biting bitch boy, cause you know what time it is. It's full time.
MMA.
Alright, full-time family, let's get to the UFC Fresno predictions. Cub Swanson versus Bryan Ortega. Holy smokes, there's so much MMA going on. After this weekend of fights, it was almost even hard to get to these fights. There's so much shit to just digest from the last weekend of fights, all the way from Bellator to the Ultimate Fighter finale, all the way to UFC 218, Holloway vs. Aldo 2, Francis Ngannou vs. Overeem. I mean, we had Perez vs. Cejudo. At the post-fight press conference, they're saying Dana White said Demetrius Johnson vs. TJ Dillashaw is pretty much booked, but there's no date. Oh my lord, it's a great time to be an MMA fan. But with that being said, we've got another great weekend of fights, at least a great night of fights at UFC Fresno on December 9th, I believe, and that's in just 6 days away. So let's get to the predictions. I know I'm a little late. I usually have these out a couple weeks before, but there's been a lot going on in the MMA world, so let's get straight to it, starting with the first fight of the night, which is between Albert Morales and Benito Lopez. Benito Lopez was from Dana White's Tuesday Night Contender Series, where he fought in a thriller, and he was one of the 2 people to earn a contract that night. Now, Albert Morales, he's 7-2-1 in his professional career, 1-2-1 in the UFC. He hasn't had the best start to his UFC career. He's most recently had a unanimous decision loss to Brett the Pikey Johns. His only win in the UFC was a closely contested split decision with Andre Sukumthath. Now, Benito Lopez, as I said, he's going to be making his UFC debut after he earned his UFC contract on Dana White's Tuesday Night Contender Series. That fight on Dana White's Tuesday Night Contender Series, I don't want to have to say that any more time, that's a fucking lot, but that fight was a really exciting fight. I mean, he won via split decision, but he was doing everything he could to finish the fight there, man. It was some very exciting striking. It was pretty much one-sided. I mean, the second round, I watched this fight again before these predictions, but it's Benito Lopez, man, he's undefeated. He's looking exciting. In the second round, he was getting controlled a little bit. You know, on the ground, he couldn't really escape. He might have been a little tired, that's what the commentators were saying, but it was because, you know, it could have been multiple things, nerves. He had a lot of people in the crowd on the side. It was the biggest fight of his life. But this guy's coming out of Team Alpha Male. He's an undefeated Team Alpha Male prospect, so you know his wrestling's got to at least be on par. So I'm not too worried about Benito Lopez's wrestling in this fight, and I think he's going to be an exciting prospect. So I'm picking Benito Lopez to get this win. Team Alpha Male undefeated prospect. As I said, he looked good in when he earned his UFC contract. Albert Morales, though, I will say, is definitely no slouch, as he's fought some really tough dudes in the UFC, but I just feel like momentum is on Benito Lopez's side as he makes his UFC debut at UFC Fresno. Now let's move to the next fight, Marcus Perez versus Erick Anders. This fight took me quite a while and quite a bit of research to really make a pick, and at the end I probably could have just flipped a coin, because both of these dudes are undefeated. Both of these dudes are 9-0. It's really hard to really gauge where both of these guys are at in their career. Marcus Perez will be making his UFC debut after an arm triangle choke submission victory to win the vacant middleweight title in LFA. I believe that's when David Branch left and joined the UFC. That was the vacant title that they fought for. He won that title via triangle choke, as I said, arm triangle choke. And he's fought each of his 9 fights in a different organization after having trouble getting people to agree to fight him. When I was doing a little research, I seen like a Reddit thread on this guy, Marcus Perez. You know, look forward for this guy. He's having, you know, a lot of people pull out when they do research on him. That even in whether it's a grappling tournament or an actual MMA fight, they realize who he is and they end up pulling out of the fight with him. But he's going against Erick Anders, who's 1-0 in the UFC. So he's had one more fight than Marcus Perez in the UFC. And Erick Anders won a national title with the University of Alabama. He's also, you know, as a football player, he's also won 7 of his 9 fights by stoppage. Now, Marcus Perez has won 6 of his 9 fights by stoppage, 3-3, 3 knockouts, 3 submissions. Erick Anders has 6 knockouts, 1 submission. But 7 of his 9 fights by stoppage. He quickly put away UFC veteran Rafael Natal in the first round with a knockout in his UFC debut. This fight, Erick Anders was originally scheduled to fight John Phillips, who pulled out about a month before the fight. So this is going to be an interesting fight. It's tough to call as Perez is definitely no slouch, but I feel like Anders will be one of the most explosive fighters Perez has fought to date, and he should be able to remain undefeated in his second UFC outing. Now let's move on to the next fight, Darrell Horcher. Darrell Horcher is the guy who fought Khabib Nurmagomedov on 9 days notice in his UFC debut. He's going to be fighting Scott Holtzman. Now Darrell Horcher is 13-2 overall in his MMA career. He's 1-1 in the UFC. He was on a 5-fight winning streak before losing his UFC debut to Khabib on 9 days notice after Tony Ferguson dropped out of the fight. But he won his second UFC fight, Darrell Horcher, via split decision versus Devin Powell. Now, in this fight, Darrell Horcher is going to be fighting Scott Holtzman, who's 10-2 and 3-2 in the UFC. He's 3-2 in his UFC career. Scott Holtzman coming off of a unanimous decision victory over Michael McBride, who is 0-2 in the UFC. But at the same time, you know, I was originally like, this fight was also hard to call, but Scott Holtzman's got more UFC experience, although he is the older fighter with less actual experience. Darrell Horcher has more overall fights but less fights in the UFC, so this fight was really hard to call for me. But originally I honestly picked Darrell Horcher, but after just looking into it a little more, I went ahead and changed my pick to Scott Holtzman. So I'm going with Holtzman, who's the older and technically less experienced fighter, but he has more UFC experience, and he's a well-rounded fighter as he usually lands a high volume of strikes as well as multiple takedowns in his fights. Although Horcher did look really good in his last fight versus Devin Powell, I feel like Scott Holtzman has had more success against tougher competition. Now, Scott Holtzman has not fought anybody as tough as Khabib Nurmagomedov, but even though Darrell Horcher took that fight, and it was a learning experience, it's not like he had much success in the fight. So he has fought a tougher guy, but Scott Holtzman has had more success against tougher guys. So I'll put it that way. Next, we're moving on to one of the most exciting fights of the night. This is probably going to be the main event, but on UFC.com it has it like the third fight, so I'll just talk about it in this order. Jermaine Sterling, the number 8th ranked bantamweight in the world, who's 14-2 overall in his MMA career, and he's 6-2 in the UFC. Jermaine looked incredible in his last fight versus Renan Barão, and he's on a 2-fight winning streak since losing a controversial split decision to Rafael Assunção. Jermaine Sterling's only 2 losses in his career were both split decisions to guys that he would most likely beat in a rematch. Now he's fighting Marlon Moraes, who's the number 7th ranked bantamweight in the world, coming off of a controversial split decision victory over John Dodson after losing his UFC debut via split decision to Rafael Assunção. Marlon Moraes is 19-6-1 in his overall MMA career, so he's got more overall fights, but he's only 1-1 in the UFC. I believe he was on like a 13-fight winning streak in like the World Series of Fighting, possibly, when he made his UFC debut. He lost his UFC debut to Rafael Assunção. As I said, it was a closely contested fight, but I feel like Rafael Assunção won the fight. Both of these guys, Jermaine and Marlon Moraes, have fought Rafael Assunção and lost via split decision, but I feel like Jermaine Sterling probably looked better in that fight. I remember Jermaine Sterling thought he won that fight, but he felt like the judges weren't appreciating his kicks. And if you look at the official fight metrics on UFC, he definitely outstruck Rafael Assunção in that fight, but he lost the split decision. So in this fight, I'm going with Sterling, though, who looked incredible in his last fight versus Renan Barão, and he's arguably had a better performance versus a common opponent. So I'm picking Jermaine Sterling, but this is going to be a great bantamweight fight for 2 of the top 10 ranked contenders. So next, we're going with fucking the kid, Jason Knight. I cannot wait to see this fight. I am a huge fan of Jason Knight, but first let's talk a little bit about his opponent, Gabriel Benitez, who's 19-7 overall in his MMA career. He's 13. He's 3-2 in his UFC career. Now, Gabriel Benitez is a striker that is 2-2 in his last 4 fights, and he's only fought twice in the last 2 years. But his most recent fight was a unanimous decision loss to Enrique Barzola, who scored 9 takedowns to 0 in the fight. Now, Gabriel Benitez is a striker, so that probably, is why is so susceptible to takedowns in his fights. And he's going to be going against the number 15 ranked featherweight in the world, Jason Knight, Mississippi Mean, the kid. What the fuck you time at? I'm a huge fan of Jason Knight. Let's talk a little bit about the kid. Jason Knight is 3-1 in his UFC career. career. He was undefeated before he stepped up and fought one of the top featherweights in the world, top 5 guys, Ricardo Lamas, on short notice. In that fight, Jason Knight was brutally finished. It was not a good look for Jason Knight, but at the same time, it was a good look because he stepped up, fought one of the best guys in the world on short notice, and Jason Knight's got all the fucking heart in the world, dog. I've watched all of his fights on Fight Pass. Every single one of them is entertaining. Jason Knight's a well-rounded fighter. He's got solid striking, and his wrestling is on point. Spear a motherfucker like Goldberg. I'm telling you, I'm a huge fan of this guy. Jason Knight's a great fighter who was undefeated, 3-0 in the UFC when he took that short notice fight, and he lost his first UFC fight, but he's 20-3 overall. He's had 23 professional fights with 20 victories already, and Jason Knight's only like 24 years old, if that, maybe 23. So I'm a huge fan of Jason Knight. I'm gonna be picking Jason Knight in this fight as well. I think this is a good match for him. He definitely got his egg scrambled in his last fight, so he had to recover from that. Hopefully he's well recovered from that Ricardo Lamas fight. I'm pretty sure he is, though. I'm not too worried about Jason Knight in this fight. I really think he's gonna have success in this fight, as he should be able to take the fight to the ground whenever he wants or needs to. As he's a good striker, but he's a well-rounded fighter. And Gabriel Benitez, who has been susceptible to takedowns, I feel like Jason Knight, it would be a smart strategy. Definitely he's a fan pleaser. He's gonna make it an entertaining fight, Jason Knight, but it's just good to have his wrestling in his back pocket for if he needs it. So I'm picking Jason Knight to get this win here. Number 15th ranked bantamweight in the world, fighting Gabriel Benitez. So yeah, this is gonna be a great fight. That's probably the fight I can't say I'm looking most forward to it, but it's up there, man. I'm really looking forward to Jason Knight's fight, but that Jermaine Sterling Marlon Moraes fight might be my fight of the night. But also the main event's gonna be a fucking great fight. I'm really looking forward to Cub Swanson's fight. All 3 of these fights, man, are fucking dope fights. Can't wait for this whole card, but let's get to the main event. Number 6th ranked featherweight in the world, Bryan Ortega, undefeated, T-City, 4-0 in the UFC. Actually 5-0 in the UFC when I did the research, which we've got to talk about, because honestly, this has been under the radar. I didn't know much about this situation. But first, he's going to be fighting Cub Swanson. Now, Bryan Ortega is 12-0 overall in his MMA career, and as I said, 5-0 in the UFC, 4-0 with 1 win overturned. Now, Bryan Ortega's had 5 fights in the UFC, and they were all 5 finishes, so that's fucking dope. I'm really looking forward to Bryan Ortega's fight. This dude's got like the fucking clutch gene, yo. Just looking at the tail of the tapes and the fight metrics. Now, his Bryan Ortega's UFC debut versus Mike De La Torre was overturned. It was a first-round finish, but it was overturned when Bryan Ortega tested positive for the anabolic steroid drostanolone, which he has since admitted to and apologized for. And when I read the apology, it was kind of shocking, because you usually don't see fighters just take it on the chin like that. Pause. But he said, like, I apologize for it. I used the substance to prepare for my UFC debut, and, I'm completely sorry. Usually people say, I was eating horse meat and shit like that, but he just took it on the chin and admitted he was taking actual steroids, for his UFC debut, or drostanolone, which they said is an anabolic steroid. So that was interesting to see. But other than that, that was his first fight in the UFC. Since then, USADA's been here and everything. He is undefeated, but I will say, those 4 fights since then, it's like at least 3 of those he would have probably lost on the judges' scorecards. But all 4 of these fights since his UFC debut, he has finished in the 3rd round. 3 of those fights, if it would have went to the judges' scorecards, he probably would have lost. But that's why I said he has the clutch gene, because he'll finish a dude in the 3rd round, and that's happened multiple times. In his last 4 fights, they're all 4 finishes in the 3rd round, but 3 of those fights he was losing. So that's fucking cool to see. So you can never count Bryan Ortega out of a fight, even though I'm not predicting him to be able to beat Cub Swanson, one of the best featherweights in the world, arguably of all time. He hasn't beat the best competition he's faced, but Cub Swanson is definitely a featherweight legend as far as I'm concerned. Cub Swanson is a fan-friendly fighter. He makes fights entertaining. He's got a lot of momentum. He's riding a 4-fight winning streak, coming off of wins over Artem Lobov, the GOAT, and the Korean Superboy Do Ho Choi in the Fight of the Year contender. Cub Swanson's last loss was to the current featherweight champion Max Holloway, and he's coming into this fight with the big chip on the shoulder as he got skipped over for his rematch with Max Holloway to fight Max Holloway for the title when he was skipped by Frankie Edgar. It was out of Cub Swanson and Frankie Edgar's who got the next title shot in the UFC went with Frankie Edgar, and Cub Swanson is on the last fight in his career. But not only did they go with Frankie Edgar over Cub Swanson, Frankie Edgar was pulled out due for injury, and Cub Swanson was one of the guys available to step up for the short notice title fight and fight Max Holloway, and the UFC went with Jose Aldo, again kind of snubbing Cub Swanson, a little bit snubbing Cub. But the thing is, Cub Swanson was scheduled to fight 1 week later, so if they would have plugged Cub Swanson into the Holloway fight, they would have had to have, a new main event for this fight. It would have been a lot of shenanigans going on, so the UFC made the decision to go with Jose Aldo, and we just saw how that fight played out last night when Max Holloway repeated his first performance and took out Jose Aldo in the third round of a thrilling night of fights. I mean, that co-main event, how can you not talk about that goddamn fucking Francis Ngannou uppercut? I seen Trobust in the comments, he said, yo, I just found Alistair's head in my front yard. Someone else replied to that comment and said, yo, I got his chin in my backyard. I was like, oh my god, I'm dead. My boy Alistair Overeem, who I predicted to win, he's dead too. No, he's not really dead, but goddamn, Francis Ngannou, what can you say about Francis Ngannou? This dude's got the appeal of Brock Lesnar without, like, the pro wrestling steroid baggage, you know what I'm saying? So I cannot fucking wait to see Francis Ngannou's next fight versus Stipe. I don't know how that's gonna go, but everything that happened, there's been so many storylines over this weekend. I still think Ngannou, no pun intended, is the biggest storyline of the weekend. That shit was insane. That punch he landed, just even though a lot of people expected it, just the fashion. I mean, Ngannou. But with that being said, these are the predictions for Cub Swanson versus Bryan Ortega in UFC Fresno. I got Cub Swanson in the main event. Gonna be a fun fight. Looking forward to these fights. And keep in mind, this is the last fight of Cub Swanson's contract. After this, the UFC is gonna have to show him the money, especially with the chip on the shoulder, or we might be seeing Cub going and becoming one of the featherweight stars of Bellator. And I got to admit, Bellator is gonna have to show Cub Swanson the money because he's worth it at this point, especially if he beats undefeated Bryan Ortega, number 4 ranked UFC fighter on a 5-fight winning streak, could have been fighting for the title. Bellator is going to be out for throwing the bank at this dude, so the UFC is going to have to pay up, or we'll see what happens. So it is what it is. These are my UFC Fight Night something, I don't even know, UFC Fight Night Fresno predictions. I know where it is, but I just don't know the number. I mean, that's a whole nother story for another day, man. It is what it is. Let the full-time failure know what the fuck you tap at in the comments. I'm out.
Da 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 da. It's the motherfucking DOWG.